You know, we often find ourselves labeling people, don't we? Maybe even ourselves sometimes. Oh, he's so selfish, or she's completely self-centered, or maybe what a selfless person. We use these words almost like quick judgments.
We really do.
But what if these aren't just, fixed boxes we put people in? What if it's more like different spots on a really complex, shifting spectrum of how we relate to each other?
That's exactly the idea we want to explore today. Welcome to our deep dive into what we're calling the self-spectrum. We're aiming to get past those simple labels and look at a more nuanced kind of dynamic continuum of human social orientation.
Right.
And the really crucial thing here, I think, is that these aren't necessarily static personality types locked in stone. They're more like distinct mindsets, each one operating with different underlying psychological gears turning.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to really get into the nitty-gritty, the psychology, the philosophy, even the behaviors tied to each mindset. We want to sort of dissect how they think, what drives them, their emotional landscapes. The goal really is to shed some light on how these internal states actually play out in our actions, how they shape our relationships. And hopefully that helps you, the listener, navigate things better, maybe even find ways for personal growth.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so let's start this exploration at one end of that spectrum, the selfish mindset. When we talk about selfishness, we're generally looking at it as something that's very action-oriented, right? Focused primarily on getting something for yourself.
That's right. Fundamentally, selfishness means being, excessively or exclusively for oneself or one's own advantage, pleasure, or welfare, regardless of others. That's the textbook definition, more or less.
Regardless of others. That's the kicker.
That's the key bit. It's an active disregard for how your actions impact other people's well-being. And, obviously, that can really eat away at trust in any kind of relationship.
It's fascinating, though, because the whole idea of selfishness, it's been debated for ages, hasn't it? Philosophically speaking. You've got traditions like, say, Western Christianity viewing it as a pretty straightforward vice.
Right, a moral failing.
But then you get thinkers like Adam Smith suggesting self-interest can actually drive economic good. And then, much more controversially, someone like Ayn Rand with objectivism basically flipping it and saying a certain kind of selfishness is actually virtuous. How do we square that circle?
Yeah, that's a really important tension to unpack. Because when most people say selfish, they usually mean what we might call exploitative selfishness. This is the idea that life's a zero-sum game. For me to win, you have to lose.
Okay.
It often involves manipulation, maybe a sense of entitlement, and crucially, a real lack of empathy. But Rand, she was talking about what she called rational selfishness.
Which is different how?
She defined it as a sort of rational, principled concern for your own well-being, but specifically not through exploiting or sacrificing others. So you're right. The word itself is this huge conceptual battleground. The takeaway, selfishness isn't just one thing. It exists on a spectrum, and different points on that spectrum have totally different implications.
Okay, so let's step back from the big philosophical ideas for a second and look at the psychology. What's actually driving this me-first approach? It seems connected to psychological hedonism, this basic drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain, like getting more money, more status.
Exactly. That drive is fundamental, and it connects to this other quite controversial idea, psychological egoism.
Ah, yes, I've heard of this.
This is the theory that argues all human actions, even the ones that look incredibly altruistic on the surface, are ultimately driven by self-interest deep down.
So like donating to charity isn't about the cause.
Well, according to this theory, it might be more about getting praise from others or avoiding feeling guilty or maybe just getting that nice feeling inside, that warm glow people talk about.
That warm glow argument, I don't know, it always feels a bit circular to me. If you just say every single act has a secret selfish motive, how could you ever prove it wrong? What's the counter-argument?
You've put your finger right on the main criticism. Philosophers like James Rachels have pointed out that it kind of misunderstands what being unselfish actually means.
How so?
Well, the unselfish person does feel good when they help someone often. That satisfaction is part of why they're motivated to help. The warm glow isn't necessarily the ultimate goal. It's more like a positive side effect, a consequence of genuinely caring. It's really important not to just redefine any positive feeling as inherently selfish. Otherwise, the word loses meaning.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. Now, here's something you mentioned earlier that feels critical. that profound lack of empathy, an exploitative selfishness. You said it's not just failing to understand someone else's view,
Right, that's more related to self-centeredness, which we'll get to.
but it's actually failing to care about their view or their feelings. That seems like the real engine behind the negative aspects. That coldness allows for the manipulation, right?
Absolutely. That emotional disconnect, or void, is what directly shapes how a selfish person behaves. You'll often see them engage in purely transactional relationships.
Meaning?
Meaning, they view other people almost like tools or resources to achieve their own ends. They tend to be takers. Any kindness shown is often conditional, like, what's in it for me?
Got it.
You'll also see manipulation and control tactics pretty frequently. They might try to dictate plans. They often refuse to compromise because their needs just feel more important, more real to them.
Mm-hmm.
And another big one is a real lack of accountability. When things go wrong, it's rarely their fault. They're quick to blame other people or bad luck or circumstances. Admitting fault or showing remorse, that doesn't really fit the pattern because their actions always seem justified from their own perspective.
And we see this stuff everywhere, sadly. In the workplace, maybe it's the colleague who deliberately keeps information to themselves to get ahead, or the boss who takes all the credit when things go well but points fingers when they don't.
Classic examples.
Or in personal life, like King Ahab in the Bible wanting Naboth's vineyard just because he wanted it. Or, a partner who always picks the movie or the restaurant and just won't budge. Even in families, maybe an adult kid who treats their parents' place like a free hotel, totally focused on their own comfort.
Exactly. These patterns show up across the board.
Okay, so let's draw that line clearly now.
Yeah.
How is being self-centered different from being selfish? Because they sound so similar, but you're saying they're fundamentally different. Self-centeredness is more cognitive, like a way of seeing things.
That's the crucial difference, yes. Selfishness, like we just discussed, is primarily about action, driven by a conscious desire for personal gain, sometimes even maliciously disregarding others. Self-centeredness, though, is more like a trait, a cognitive framework. It's an excessive focus on your own world, but it often stems more from a kind of unawareness or a blind spot than outright malice.
Right, like an ingrained way of processing information. And the psychological root for that is what's called egocentrism, which you said isn't necessarily a moral failing, but more a cognitive limit.
Precisely. Jean Piaget's work on childhood egocentrism is the classic example. A little kid suggests getting his mom a toy truck for her birthday. Why? Because he loves toy trucks. And he genuinely struggles to grasp that her desires might be totally different from his.
Okay, get that for kids.
Well, while those really obvious forms usually fade, subtler versions hang around in adulthood. We call it the egocentric bias. It's this pervasive cognitive tendency where we naturally over-rely on our own perspective. We sort of experience the world as if we're the main character in everyone else's movie, too.
Yeah, I can see that. And this way of processing, this filtering everything through me, it happens mostly unconsciously, right? It's like our brain's default setting.
Exactly. There are a few reasons why. First, information asymmetry. You simply have way more direct access to your own thoughts, feelings, and intentions than anyone else's. Your internal world is just louder, more vivid. Then there's self-referential memory. Our brains are actually wired to encode and recall information related to ourselves more easily and deeply. And finally, our brains love shortcuts heuristics. It's just cognitively easier to assume others see the world like we do than to constantly try and figure out their unique perspective.
And this bias leads to those funny things like the spotlight effect, thinking everyone notices that tiny coffee stain on your shirt.
Right. When in reality, they're probably worried about their own metaphorical coffee stain.
Or the false consensus effect, assuming way more people agree with your political views or taste in music than actually do.
So, okay, if you're dealing with someone stuck in this mindset, what does that actually mean?
It means you're often dealing with someone who's, in a way, trapped inside their own cognitive prison. They're not necessarily trying to be difficult or hurtful. Their perceptual filters just keep redirecting everything back to, how does this affect me? How does this relate to my experience? Some research even hints at a neurological basis, maybe involving how the thalamus filters sensory input based on personal relevance. So if that's the internal wiring, how does it typically show up in their behavior? What are the signs?
Well, you often see conversational dominance. They might monopolize the chat, constantly steer things back to their own experiences, or seem like they're just waiting for a gap to talk rather than truly listening.
I know people like that.
Another sign is a kind of insensitivity or lack of curiosity about others. They might seem to downplay other people's problems or rarely ask follow-up questions simply because their focus is so strongly inward.
Right.
And third, you might notice a subtle or not so subtle sense of entitlement or unrealistic expectations, like the rules don't quite apply to them, or that others should naturally accommodate their needs without much thought for reciprocity.
Yeah, you can see how that plays out. Like the friend who, you're pouring your heart out about a major crisis and they interrupt to complain about their bad haircut.
Exactly. Or the boss who gets the team to work crazy hours on their pet project, then just drops it without a word of thanks because they got bored.
Or in a meeting, someone who constantly talks over others, or subtly takes credit for a group idea, maybe not even maliciously, but because their perception genuinely centers their own contribution.
Precisely. It's that perceptual distortion at work.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's go all the way to the other end of our spectrum. The selfless mindset. This is about genuine concern for others,
Yep.
right? Rooted in feeling connected.
Exactly. This is where we talk about altruism. The term actually comes from the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who coined altruism specifically as the opposite of egoism. Psychologically, we see it as a motivational state. The ultimate goal is to increase someone else's welfare, often without consciously expecting anything back for yourself.
But here comes that tricky philosophical question again. Can altruism ever be totally pure? If you feel good helping someone, doesn't that warm glow argument pop back up, saying it's still self-interest?
It's the perennial debate. But I think a more useful way to look at it is that an act can still be genuinely altruistically motivated, even if other motives are present too. The key factor is the presence of real concern for the other person as a significant driving force.
So like your earlier example of slowing down the car?
Right. You might slow down partly because you genuinely don't want kids to get hurt and partly because you don't want a ticket. The concern for the kids' welfare is still a real altruistic motivation in the mix. That warm glow, again, is often a result of acting on that genuine concern, not the primary goal. Fundamentally, the unselfish person is someone who actually finds joy and meaning in contributing to others' well-being.
Okay, that feels like a much more practical and frankly human way to look at it. So if this mindset is about we first, what's the core psychological engine driving it?
Unquestionably, it's empathy. And empathy itself isn't just one thing, it's complex. We usually break it down into three key parts.
Yeah.
First, there's cognitive empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That's the ability to understand someone else's perspective, to kind of mentally put yourself in their shoes. Second, affective empathy or emotional empathy. That's feeling an appropriate emotional response with them, like feeling distress when you see someone else in pain.
Right.
But the component most directly linked to actually doing something selfless is compassionate empathy, sometimes called empathic concern. That's the active desire to help, to act, to relieve their suffering, or make things better for them.
And isn't that connected to Daniel Batson's work, the empathy-altruism hypothesis?
Exactly. His research pretty convincingly shows that when you experimentally induce empathy in people, get them to really feel for someone else, they're much more likely to help, even if it costs them something personally. And of course, empathy isn't the only driver. Other pro-social motivations feed into selfless acts too, like reciprocity, the idea of mutual helping or group-selected altruism, helping your own group survive, or acting out of strong moral principles, or even nepotistic altruism, helping close relatives. They all push us towards that other-focused orientation.
So with these powerful motivators, what does the selfless mindset look like in action? What's the behavioral blueprint?
Well, it shows up in all sorts of pro-social behaviors. Things like consistently helping others, offering comfort, sharing resources, cooperating effectively. There's a consistent focus on noticing and responding to others' needs, a willingness to make sacrifices, whether it's time, energy, or money, all aimed at building stronger connections and contributing positively.
And we see this on so many levels, don't we? From tiny everyday things like holding the elevator, giving a genuine compliment, letting someone merge in traffic, bringing a coworker coffee just because. Those little things matter.
They really do. They build social fabric.
Then there are bigger things. People who dedicate time to volunteering, make anonymous donations, or spend years mentoring someone.
Significant commitments, definitely.
And then you have these extraordinary acts of self-sacrifice. The classic examples like a mother bear defending her cubs, or a soldier shielding comrades from harm, or someone donating a kidney to a complete stranger.
Those represent the far end of that spectrum,
Yeah.
driven by incredibly strong empathic concern or principle.
Okay, so let's try to bring all three mindsets, selfish, self-centered, selfless together. We've established they're not just separate boxes, but points on this flowing continuum.
Exactly. And if we synthesize the core distinctions, selfishness is primarily action-oriented, focused on personal gain, and defined by a lack of empathic concern. Its worldview is transactional, often seeing things as win-lose.
Right.
Self-centeredness is more trait-based, a cognitive self-preoccupation marked by a lack of empathic awareness or perspective-taking. Its worldview is perceptual, filtered through the self.
Got it.
And selflessness is motivation-based, driven by genuine concern for others and characterized by the presence of empathy, particularly compassionate empathy. Its worldview is relational, seeing interdependence.
Now, here's where I think it gets really practical and nuanced. We need to talk about the edges, right? Because not all focus on the self is bad, surely.
Oh, absolutely not. That's where the idea of healthy self-interest or self-awareness comes in.
Yeah.
It's crucial. Recognizing your own needs, setting healthy boundaries, practicing self-care, these are essential. Think of the put your own oxygen mask on first analogy.
Yeah.
This isn't the same as exploitative selfishness. It's about having the resources and stability within yourself so that you can show up for others effectively and sustainably.
Yeah.
It actually enables genuine connection.
But then there's also a potential downside to being too focused on others, isn't there? The dark side of selflessness.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. That's what's sometimes termed pathological altruism. This is where the impulse to help becomes harmful, either to yourself leading to burnout, self-neglect, getting taken advantage of because your boundaries are too weak, or sometimes even harmful to the person you're trying to help, perhaps by enabling unhealthy behaviors or preventing them from developing their own resilience. True well-being requires balance, not swinging to either extreme of total self-focus or total self-neglect.
That balance is key. So how can we use this understanding to navigate our relationships better? What are the practical applications?
Okay, so if you recognize you're dealing with someone operating primarily from a selfish mindset, the focus needs to be on self-protection. Set firm boundaries. Try not to take their behavior personally. Remember, it reflects their internal calculus, not your value. And in some cases, if the behavior is consistently harmful, creating distance might be the healthiest option.
Right. What about the self-centered person?
With a primarily self-centered mindset, remember, it's often about unawareness rather than malice. So manage your expectations. Use clear and assertive communication you might need to explicitly state your needs or perspective, because they might genuinely not pick up on hints. Sometimes you can even try gentle debiasing techniques, like explicitly asking, how do you think they might feel about this? Or what might this look like from her perspective, to nudge them towards considering other views.
That's helpful. It shifts the focus from frustration to strategy. Now, flipping it around, how can we, maybe in our families or workplaces or communities, actually encourage more selflessness?
That's a great question. We can consciously try to foster more pro-social environments. Modeling altruistic behavior ourselves is huge. Expressing genuine gratitude when people are helpful reinforces that behavior. And structuring things, where possible, to reward cooperation and mutual support rather than just individual competition can shift the cultural norm.
And what about our own personal development? How can understanding the spectrum help us grow?
Well, if you recognize tendencies towards self-centeredness in yourself, the path towards greater self-awareness involves deliberately turning your focus outward. Practices like mindfulness can help you notice your own thought patterns. Active listening, really trying to understand, not just waiting to speak, is crucial. And cultivating genuine curiosity about other people's lives and experiences broadens your perspective.
And empathy, you said that's learnable.
Yes, absolutely. Empathy is like a muscle. You can strengthen it. You can practice cognitive empathy by making a conscious effort. Okay, let me imagine the situation from their point of view. What pressures might they be under? What might they be feeling?
Okay.
You can engage in compassion-focused practices, like loving-kindness meditation, where you actively send well wishes to others, even people you find difficult. And something as simple as regularly practicing gratitude naturally shifts your focus from what you lack or want to appreciating what others contribute, which fosters that other-oriented perspective.
So it sounds like the real aim isn't some extreme form of self-denial, but achieving that healthy, sustainable balance you mentioned, where self-respect and looking after yourself actually become the foundation for being able to genuinely care for others.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Self-care isn't selfish. It's often the prerequisite for effective and sustainable altruism.
Wow. We've really covered a lot of ground today. Moving from the simple labels selfish, self-centered, selfless, to seeing this dynamic self-spectrum. Understanding the selfish mindset as transactional and action-based,
Mm-hmm.
the self-centered one as perceptual and cognitive,
Right.
and the selfless one is relational and driven by motivation and empathy.
And the hopeful message here, I think, is that while things like our biology and how we were raised definitely influence where we tend to sit on this spectrum, we're not stuck. We really do have the capacity to shift our position through cultivating that self-awareness we talked about, and critically, through intentionally developing our empathy. The goal isn't perfection, but maybe striving towards an evolving self, one that's balanced, aware, respects itself, and is also deeply connected to the well-being of those around us.
That's a powerful idea. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. As you reflect on these different mindsets, think about your own tendencies and interactions. What's maybe one small conscious step you could take this week, just one thing, to shift your own position along that self spectrum? Not just for you, but for the quality of your relationships too.